Hello and welcome. I am Panda, and today we're talking about Order of the Crimson Arm, a Fire Emblem 7 ROM hack by TheMaskedRaider. And today we're going to be analyzing Chapter 19, Unseen Danger. When I played this hack, I felt that it was a tale of two halves, with the first half of the hack being really strong and the second part of the hack dragging a bit, as the second part largely had these, large maps that didn't really stand out compared to the tighter experience of the early game. However, when I played the hack, one chapter in the late game stood out from the rest, and that's Chapter 19, Unseen Danger, which you can see on your screen. I do want to talk about this chapter because I think it's a neat concept that is executed well, and a really great example of how to deviate from typical late game FE formula. If you ever played a vanilla Fire Emblem game by Intelligent Systems or even other ROM hacks, you know that oftentimes the last stretch of chapters generally consist of these massive meat grinders where you can get experience for your army in prep for the final battle. It's a lot of these maps where you're kind of getting a little too big for your britches and it's a big cognitive load, but they aren't particularly interesting. Lots of route, lots of seas, big open field maps. Lots of enemy phase, can take a while to get through but aren't super challenging. A lot of FE late games are kind of like this and generally aren't super fun to play. I'm in the camp that if your map is too big or has too many enemies in it, the cognitive load on the player can get a little too high, making players wish they can warp skip the chapter to end it sooner, or worse, they're bored and slam wait and then grind out with their superpowered lord or a paladin with a hand axe, just trying to get the experience through as quickly as possible because the map is just too dang big and there's too much going on. And not enough interesting things going on, to be clear. So, Chapter 19 of OCA deviates from this late game formula and does so by creating a high concept map in a part of the game that normally strays from these. While some designers want to make chapters approaching endgame big and epic, there's something to be said about a tight experience with high level units and a unique concept that challenges you to approach a map differently versus 72 turns of Conquer in a massive field. No offense, TLP, but I will talk about you more someday. That chapter gets memed on way too hard, by the way. I don't think it's as bad as everyone says, but it's to illustrate my point on late game being needlessly grandiose. So let's keep on going. So what about this map is so different and great? Well, immediately the anti-turtle objective in the map is clear. You're blocking Gorman's escape. Gorman is the warrior boss, so you can see kind of flashing in the middle of the screen. He just found out that your army has entered the building and he's trying to get the heck out with a rare relic that he's been assigned to guard. So he's hoping to flee the scene before he can get captured and the relic is taken, thus failing his mission. So it's your job as Algemus and his crew to chase him down and grab the relic and then defeat whoever else is around. So immediately you're rushing down through enemies on the outer corridors, and it's presented as a player phase affair, trying to quickly catch up to him as he moves without impunity through that center path you can see. At the bottom of the map, there's a switch that pulls up a gate, triggering an event and an AI change, and this is where things get really interesting. So now when Gorman is blocked off, his AI changes to attack the player. Locked in with your army, he has nothing left to do but try and fight his way out. It's a cool change, and the map dynamics shift quickly, and I always find this kind of mid-map objective switch really difficult to pull off. But MaskedRaider is transparent. The mapped objectives is always route, and even if Gorman leaves, you can still win by routing the rest, allowing the player to play at their own pace if they don't want to try for him, and reducing the likelihood of getting softlocked. I think that's so important that routing the enemy is still the objective throughout, even though yes, there's story purpose for capturing him, it's not necessarily something that every player needs to do because some players might not be able to or may not want to play that fast and want to approach it at their own pace. And having that duality in options, I think, is really key to making an inclusive experience, especially in the late game where there's so many deviations on how the player's army might look and feel that you can't expect everyone to be able to physically achieve this goal. So I think route is the right objective here, and I think that having the side objective of the boss is pretty neat. Now, in addition to going down south, you can also go to the top right corner where you can recruit Isaac, who's a beefy berserker trapped in a chest, one of OCA's more interesting and memorable recruitments. but it's further benefiting players who split, as they can do this faster than someone who just goes down one single path. So again, getting things done faster is your jam, then splitting up is the way to go, and this map I think executes on that pretty well. What I really want to focus on here is how the map objective switches changes how you play without feeling unfair. Oftentimes, I find that when maps surprise players with objective changes, it can feel unfair in that it's a total surprise, or be easy to cheese if you know where a new enemy is going to spawn. In this chapter, whether you are blind or know what you're doing, it still remains pretty fair, partially because you need to rush to trigger the change in the first place, but also because triggering the change doesn't mean new enemies spawn in a new location, the objective itself doesn't change, but how you approach the map does. Switching from a dead sprint to the switch to block them off to now needing to fight a group of enemies is a much smoother change, but still a change that keeps this map dynamic and fresh in my opinion. You go from this pure offensive rush to a mixed or a defensive approach, depending on how you choose to approach the enemies after Gorman changes his AI. How you want to attack him will make the player shift how they approach. And I think it's really hard to execute that kind of mind shift change really well. I'd say oftentimes in Fire Emblem, you're likely going to stick with a single strategy the entire way. You're going to rush to the gate. You're going to rush to defeat the boss. You're going to play defensively until its clock runs out. This chapter has you rush, and then you're kind of presented with a different challenge. Okay, I may need to play defensively here as the boss is now, who was once running away, is now charging me. That's something that's interesting and not something that is done very often. So it creates that unique experience. Now that said, as much as I like this aspect of the map where you're changing how you play as a result of your actions and that you're interacting with the map in a meaningful way, it does have some shortcomings that I do want to call out. Specifically, even though the switch triggers an AI change by the boss, the rest of the enemies remain stationary, and this feels a bit incongruent with the change, as the enemies previously forming a wall to allow for Gorman's escape still remain still, meaning you can bait and switch your way through the rest of the map, which can really kill the pacing. I think given the desperation of the situation and the way that Braxis, which is Gorman's faction or country, is characterized, it would make more sense and make the map way more dynamic if all the enemies started charging the player. While it'd make the map harder, it would also improve the gameplay story integration on the back half of the map considerably. The reason I say this is because it presents itself as such a rush, and then all of the enemies kind of just remain still and wait for you to route them. It kind of defeats the purpose of having the route objective in some ways, where all the enemies just still remain stationary even after the leader has made this change. It just feels kind of inconsistent. I would assume that if a leader decides to charge, that everyone else would charge with him versus everyone kind of stands around and waits for you to get into their range. I think it's the biggest shortcoming of the map, and I think having the enemies charge would really up that defensive pressure after having this quick offensive rush, which I think could be a cool way to accentuate what the chapter has already achieved. I'll also add that additionally, the first time I played this, I was unsure what the switch was and how to trigger it. There was a door I could not open with Mela, who is my rogue, and which also felt a bit off. Upon waiting on the conspicuous space, the door opened to a secret room, and Gorman's escape route was cut off. I'm not a big fan of maps showing door tiles that look that they are openable, but then aren't, except through special events like this. So you can see this armor right here is covering that space, and that door to his right is actually not able to be opened except through the switch. This kind of thing isn't really clearly communicated to the player, and I think can create a bit of a poor experience if the player is assuming they could maybe get the chest first or open up the room first before committing to the switch. It's a little bit of a gotcha moment, but thankfully it isn't too consequential in this case. But in other contexts, it could effectively function as an ambush spawn, causing quite a bit of trouble. For me, I always think it feels bad as a player to misunderstand what the map is asking you to do, and it can lead to frustrating resets that come from info not being communicated. While this gripe is minor, I would recommend tweaking it so that there's no ambiguity when planning how you want to play, as well as how you approach the map. So something for all of you hack ROM designers to consider. Lastly, I'll add that Gorman can be cheesed over the wall pretty easily with a longbow, which while not unique to Fire Emblem, feels kind of deflating. There isn't really that much that can be done about it since it depends on where you catch him. Maybe removing his 2 range who doesn't go for the wall could help, but I need to play around with it to know for sure. You can see that cracked wall there. I would ultimately go on to plant a unit there who would dodge his tomahawk attacks or his bow attacks, and then I'd use Bolslav, the lad, to attack from far away with the longbow just to chip him down, and there really wasn't much he could do about it. So the map's layout ultimately ends up working to its detriment because the boss becomes very easy to cheese, depending on where you catch him and how you choose to engage him. So some small tweaks to this map I think ultimately would make it a lot better, but it still stands out in my mind as a pretty memorable experience. And especially when you consider that it's in a sea of seize and defeat boss maps, and as an attempt to do something different leading into the final chapter. And I think stuff like this is really important. I think that a lot of hacks and vanilla games don't really do the high concept stuff later into the maps. They kind of treat it as, hey, you have these super powered buff units you've been training for 15, 20 chapters. We're just going to let you kind of go wild with them. And while that has its place and can be fun, I think these kinds of different style maps that are more conceptual and involve AI changes that drastically alter how you approach the map, I think are cool and should be explored more. Road to Ruin does something similar in Chapter 16 with its switches, and that also stands out to me in my mind. And I think that that's worth something when you consider that if a player is playing your game and it's a full-length hack of 20 to 30 chapters, even longer perhaps, that some of the chapters stand out. And I think that these conceptual maps usually do a great job of standing out in the player's mind as being memorable and interesting, and the kinds of chapters that make them want to return and replay your game again. And lastly, and ultimately, it's your goal as a designer to make your maps fair, challenging, and fun. And in part of Fire Emblem games that are typically dull and drawn out, it stands out as a way to make the late game more exciting and different than like Part 4 of Radiant Dawn's endless route maps. So I hope you all can keep that in mind. I hope this was helpful. I really like this map quite a lot. I think there's a lot of cool stuff it does. I think that you can certainly do conceptual stuff with higher leveled units, even though it's not very common. You just kind of have to apply those same principles that you would to an early map here, and just make sure that you do a lot of testing and balancing to make sure it's both fun and fair. So thanks again for watching, and let me know your thoughts on this map. Definitely recommend giving it a try next time you play this game. Until then, everyone, take care, and I'll see you next time. Be safe.